Welcome. When you look at your own family tree, maybe something you found online or a scroll someone kept, what's the baseline expectation?
Well, you expect it to be real, right? A factual chain of names,
Yeah.
something you could, potentially verify legally or historically. It's meant to be a record.
Exactly. A document of record, not really a piece of, say, persuasive writing.
Not rhetoric, no. It's about lineage, identity, maybe inheritance, facts.
Okay, so hold that thought. Because today we're doing a deep dive into two extremely famous and frankly, highly scrutinized genealogies, the lists for Jesus in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3.
And the critical historical sources we're digging into today, pulling from decades of work by scholars like Raymond Brown, Geza Vermes, Richard Carrier, they argue something pretty radical.
What's the core argument?
They argue these lists aren't archival documents at all. They propose that they are, in a very specific literary sense, conscious fabrications. Now, that sounds harsh, but it's not about accusing someone of lying in a modern sense.
It's more like a genre diagnosis.
Precisely. It's saying these are deliberately crafted literary pieces. They're designed, top to bottom, for theological persuasion, not for just lifting names accurately like an archive would. Think of them as sermons, really, just presented in the form of ancestry.
Okay, so that's the big tension we need to unpack for you, the listener. The central question is this. Do Matthew's and Luke's lists actually hold up as genuine family registers? Or do they show clear signs, maybe overwhelming signs, of being intentionally composed for theological reasons?
We're basically going to weigh the evidence. Does it look like record keeping, or does it look like preaching using the language of family history?
All right, before we jump into the names themselves, Matthew's list, Luke's list, we need to set some ground rules, some benchmarks. We're going to use a loaded term like fabrication. Even in that specialized sense, we need objective ways to tell the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. What makes one list look like an archive and another look like, well, theology?
What are the criteria scholars use?
It really comes down to genre fit. What job is the text doing? If it's supposed to be a historical record, you'd expect it to care most about known facts, continuity, fitting with other records. But if it's a sermon,
Then the message comes first.
exactly, pattern, symbol, the theological point, those become the priorities, even if it means bending the historical details or, leaving things out. So we need a kind of checklist to figure out the intent behind the list.
Okay, let's build that checklist. 6 key areas scholars look at. What's the first thing you check if you suspect it's more composition than record?
The first big one is architectonics. That's just a fancy word for the structure. Does the list look, well, organic, like it just grew name by name over time, or does it look engineered?
Engineered how? Like too perfect.
Yeah, like numerical patterns that seem too neat. Symmetries, grouping names into artificial blocks. Or, crucially, obvious gaps lacunae, where names we know should be are missing, just to make the numbers work out or hit a specific target. A real list is usually messy. A theological argument might prefer geometry.
Okay, structure. What's next? Since these lists cover Bible history.
Right, biblical cross-checking. How well do Matthew's and Luke's lists actually line up with the genealogies and king lists we already have in the Hebrew Bible? In Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, those are older benchmarks.
And how well do they line up with each other? They're both about Jesus, presumably tracing his line back.
That's critical. If they're supposedly drawing from the same reality, major disagreements between Matthew and Luke are a huge red flag. It tells you something's going on besides simple transcription.
Okay, structure, cross-checking. Now let's hit what seems like the biggest logical hurdle, even before looking at names.
Ah, yes. The Joseph paradox.
Yeah.
Criterion 3. Conceptual coherence. This is fundamental. Both Matthew and Luke state very clearly that Jesus' conception was virginal, that Joseph was not the biological father.
So if Joseph isn't the biological father, what's the point of tracing a biological line through him?
Exactly. The whole purpose of a biological genealogy, especially in this context, proving Jesus is physically descended from David, seems to be completely undercut, logically nullified by the virgin conception claim itself.
So if the list isn't doing that primary job, it must be doing something else. Symbolically, maybe?
Which leads straight to number 4, theological markers. Are there things in the list that just scream theology, not archive? Things a legal clerk would never include, but a preacher absolutely would.
Like what?
Like Matthew, deliberately including those 4 specific kind of scandalous women. Or Luke deciding to run the list all the way back, not just to Abraham, but to Adam, to the very beginning. These aren't neutral choices. They're building theological arguments right into the list's content and shape. Persuasion, not just data.
And the fact that people had to try and fix the lists later, That's also evidence.
Definitely. Point 5, the history of harmonization. The problems, the contradictions between Matthew and Luke, they weren't discovered yesterday. They were obvious right from the start, even to early church figures. And this led to centuries of really elaborate, sometimes kind of desperate attempts to make the two lists fit together.
Like the whole levirate marriage idea.
That's the classic example. We'll get into it. But these complex scenarios invented solely to reconcile the lists. The very fact they were needed suggests the originals weren't simple compatible records. The cure highlights the disease, so to speak.
Okay, so structure, cross-checking, the Joseph problem, theological flags, and the history of trying to fix it. That brings us to the final point.
Yeah, number 6 wraps it all up. Genre fit. Taking all that evidence together, the patterns, the omissions, the contradictions, the theological signals, the need for harmonization, does this thing function like a document meant for legal proof? Does it prioritize accuracy and coherence? Or does it function like a proclamation, using the form of ancestry to persuade you of a theological truth? That's the ultimate question.
Let's dive into Matthew then. Because Matthew 1 starts right off with that very clear, very deliberate structure you mentioned.
It really does. It's almost impossible to miss. Matthew explicitly divides his list into 3 sections, and he tells you each section has 14 generations. Abraham to David, 14. David to the Babylonian exile, 14. Exile to Joseph, or rather to Jesus, 14.
3 sets of 14. That sounds neat. Maybe too neat.
That's exactly what critical scholars argue. Raymond Brown, for instance, did exhaustive work on this. His analysis shows this perfect 3x14 structure isn't just how history happened to fall, it's an engineered scheme, not an archival rhythm.
How do we know it's engineered? Did he leave people out?
Yes, precisely. When you compare Matthew's list, especially the royal line section, to the established king lists in, say, the Book of Chronicles in the Hebrew Bible, you find missing names. Matthew selectively omits certain kings.
Why? Just to hit the number 14?
It appears so. To make the panels fit, particularly getting the transitions right and making that third panel land perfectly on 14, known figures from the Old Testament record are simply dropped. An archivist trying to be complete wouldn't do that. But an author trying to make a specific structural point would. Matthew seems to prioritize the 3x14 pattern over a comprehensive list.
And why 14? Is there a reason for that specific number? It seems kind of random otherwise.
Well, it's almost certainly not random. This is where we get into gematria.
Okay, explain gematria quickly. Assigning numbers to letters.
Exactly. It was a common practice in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Hebrew letters also function as numbers. Matthew's big opening claim right there in verse 1 is that Jesus is the son of David.
Right.
The name David in Hebrew is spelled with 3 consonants. Dalet, Vav, Dalet, D, Dav, DD.
In the numerical values.
Dalet is 4. Vav is 6. The final Dalet is 4. So 4 plus 6 plus 4 equals 14. So by structuring the entire genealogy around 3 panels of 14, Matthew is basically embedding the son of David claim into the very architecture of the list. It's like a numerical chant. David, David, David.
Wow. So the list itself is the argument in a way. The shape proves the point.
It functions as a symbolic credential. It's rhetoric through numbers. Whether you could historically verify every single link becomes secondary to the overwhelming structural message. This lineage culminates in the promised son of David. It's pure theological composition. Homiletics, really.
Okay, that's a huge piece of evidence for intention. And speaking of things that signal intention, Matthew includes those 4 women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, though he calls her the wife of Uriah. Why them?
Yeah, this is another major theological marker. In a typically patriarchal genealogy, singling out women is unusual. Singling out these 4 is extraordinary. Why not Sarah or Rebecca, the great matriarchs?
So who are they and why are they significant?
We'll look at their stories. Tamar. She posed as a prostitute to seduce her father-in-law Judah to get her rightful heir, Rahab. A Gentile woman in Jericho, often identified as a prostitute who helped the Israelites, Ruth. A Moabitess, another Gentile outsider who shows great faithfulness. And Bathsheba, mentioned obliquely as Uriah's wife, directly invoking David's great sin, adultery, and murder.
So there's a pattern of irregularity, Gentiles, scandal, maybe transgression.
Exactly. Michael Golder's analysis here is really insightful. He argues this is midrashic. It's steeped in scriptural interpretation. Matthew seems to be highlighting a pattern in salvation history where God works through unexpected, even scandalous circumstances and includes outsiders, Gentiles.
Is the point to prepare the reader for Mary?
That seems very likely. By establishing this pattern of divine work through irregularity and potential scandal, Matthew prepares the reader for the ultimate irregularity, the virginal conception of Jesus through Mary. The list subtly urges, don't be shocked by Mary. God has worked this way before. It's apologetics woven into the genealogy. Again, proclamation, not archive.
Okay, but Matthew's structure creates another problem, doesn't it? A big one. The Jeconiah problem. He traces the line through King Jeconiah. Why is that risky?
It's incredibly risky from an archival or legal standpoint. Matthew follows the main royal line from Solomon, and that line goes directly through Jeconiah, who's also called Coniah. The problem is a devastating prophecy in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 22, verse 30.
What does Jeremiah say about Jeconiah?
It's brutal. God says effectively, record this man as childless, a man who shall not prosper, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David or ruling again in Judah. It's a divine curse declaring his line ineligible for the throne.
Wow. So why would Matthew deliberately choose a path that includes someone explicitly barred by prophecy from producing a king? Wouldn't an archivist avoid that line like the plague?
You'd think so. If your goal is simply to prove a legitimate claim to the throne, you'd find another way, maybe traced through a different branch if possible. The fact that Matthew doesn't avoid Jeconiah strongly suggests something else was more important to him.
The 3 by 14 structure.
It has to be. The need to maintain the Solomonic royal line, to make the Davidic connection, and to make it fit the perfect 3 by 14 gematria pattern seems to have overridden the massive prophetic problem posed by Jeconiah. The architecture trumped the archival caution. It shows theology under construction, prioritizing the symbolic message over cleaning up historical or prophetic difficulties.
So, Matthew's list. Intentional geometry, gematria reinforcing the core message, unusual women signaling a theological pattern, and even choosing a prophetically cursed line to maintain the structure. It feels less like a record and more like a carefully built argument.
The fingerprints of deliberate theological design are just all over it. It's preaching in the language of ancestry.
Okay, let's shift gears to Luke's genealogy, found later in his Gospel, chapter 3. Right away, it feels different. Matthew goes forward, Abraham to Jesus. Luke goes backward.
Completely backward. It's a striking difference in approach. Luke starts with Jesus, then names Joseph, then Heli, and keeps going back generation by generation, past David, past Abraham.
All the way to Adam.
All the way to Adam. And then Luke adds, Son of God. It immediately signals a vastly different theological scope compared to Matthew.
How so? Matthew starts with Abraham, focusing on Jesus' Jewish identity, the son of David, son of Abraham. Luke, going back to Adam. What does that emphasize?
Universality. By tracing the line back to Adam, the father of all humanity, Luke is framing Jesus not just as the Jewish Messiah, but as relevant to everyone. It sets up themes that are central to Luke Acts. Jesus as the second Adam, the restorer of humanity, and the mission to the Gentiles that follows.
So the direction itself is a theological statement.
Absolutely. Raymond Brown points this out. It's about affirming Jesus' identity on a cosmic scale. It connects him to the very foundation of creation. It's, again, preaching by architecture, but with a universal focus instead of Matthew's specific Davidic focus.
And the specific names differ immediately too, right? Starting with Joseph's father.
Instantly. Matthew 1.16 says Jacob was the father of Joseph. Luke 3.23 says Joseph was the son of Heli. Not a typo, not a minor variant. Two different fathers.
So right at the start, the lines diverge.
They do. And the divergence becomes even more profound when you trace it back further, specifically from King David.
How do they differ there?
Matthew, as we saw, traces the line down from David through his son Solomon, the royal successor, leading eventually to the cursed Jeconiah. Luke, however, takes a completely different branch. He traces the line from David through another son, Nathan.
Nathan wasn't in the main royal line, was he?
No. So Luke consciously chooses a non-royal, or at least less prominent, Davidic branch. This is a massive difference. It shows we're not looking at two slightly different copies of one family tree. We're looking at two distinct theological constructions using different paths to make different points, even when starting from the same figure, David.
Geza Vermes really stresses this, right? That Luke's list is clearly compiled for theological reasons, not legal verification.
Yes, Vermes argues its function is theological affirmation. And some scholars, like Brown again, note other compositional aims. For instance, if you count the names in Luke from Jesus back to Adam, depending on the manuscript tradition, you often get 77 names.
77. Is that number significant?
It can be. 7 is a number of perfection or completion. 77, 7 times 11, could symbolize ultimate completion, or perhaps represent all the nations of the world in some symbolic way, fitting Luke's universal theme. Whether it's exactly 77 or just a generally long, impressive list aiming for that kind of scope, the effort involved points again to composition, not just copying.
So Luke is also building an argument with his structure, just a different one. Universal scope, second Adam, maybe symbolic numbers.
It seems clear. Matthew uses tight royal numerology. Luke uses a broad universal sweep back to creation. Both are structuring ancestry to serve a specific theological message, overriding any concern for simply recording one consistent line.
Okay, we've seen Matthew's structure and Luke's structure. Now we have to face the stark reality of putting them side by side, especially in that long stretch between King David and Joseph.
This is where the archival claim really falls apart for most critical scholars. It's not just minor differences. As Robert Price puts it, the lists are almost entirely non-overlapping in that crucial section.
How different are we talking?
Hugely different. Matthew lists about 27 names between David and Joseph. Luke lists around 41 names in that same span. And crucially, they are almost completely different names. They represent two parallel, incompatible lines.
But wait, don't they share a couple of names? I think Shealtiel and Zerubbabel appear in both lists. Doesn't that suggest some connection?
They do share those two names, yes. They were important figures in the post-exilic period. But even this apparent overlap highlights the problem when you look closer.
How so?
Look at who their fathers are in each list. Matthew says Shealtiel's father was the cursed king Jeconiah. Luke says Shealtiel's father was someone completely different, Neri or Neriah.
Yeah.
So even the two shared names are embedded within fundamentally different lineages. It doesn't bridge the gap, it just shows both authors needed to include these known figures but connected them differently.
So this massive divergence, maybe over 90% different names in that key period. What does that signal to a historian looking at these texts?
It functions as a clear genre signal. It tells you these are not two independent attempts to transcribe a single, fixed, verifiable family record. If two people went to the same archive and came back with lists this different, you'd conclude the archive was corrupt, the researchers were incompetent, or more likely they weren't actually working from a fixed archive at all.
So the divergence itself suggests they were drawing from what, fluid traditions or just making them up?
It suggests they were likely working with fluid, perhaps evolving, oral or literary traditions about Davidic descent, or that they felt free to construct lists that served their theological and structural needs, possibly building on biblical names and patterns. Either way, it moves decisively away from the idea of transcribing a static historical family file.
And then layering on top of all this structural difference, all this incompatibility, we come back to that core narrative point.
Yeah.
The virgin conception.
Yes, the logical nullifier. Scholars like Vermes and Price drive this home. Both Gospels insist Joseph is not the biological father. So how can a genealogy trace meticulously through Joseph's supposed biological ancestors prove that Jesus is physically of David?
The biological link is broken by the core story itself.
Precisely. The mechanism by which the genealogy is supposed to work biological descent is explicitly denied by the surrounding narrative.
Now, a common response here, the traditional defense, is to pivot to legal sonship. Joseph adopted Jesus, or named him, and that conferred Davidic status legally.
That's the standard apologetic argument, yes. Joseph as a legal father transfers the lineage, but this runs into problems too from a critical perspective.
What are the problems with the legal adoption argument?
Well, first, for a legal claim, you'd ideally want a clear, consistent, verifiable record. But what we have are two contradictory lists, both showing signs of heavy theological editing, Matthew's omissions, and gematria, Luke's different branch. These don't look like reliable legal documents you'd present in court.
They look like arguments, not affidavits.
Exactly. Second, it's not entirely clear that Jewish law at the time universally allowed for the full transfer of tribal lineage, especially royal lineage, through legal adoption alone without a biological link. It's debated. But the main point is, the lists themselves, because they are so clearly shaped by theological artistry and are mutually incompatible, undermine their own potential function as straightforward legal evidence.
So the conclusion is they're aiming for something else entirely. They legitimate Jesus's messianic identity theologically, using the form of ancestry, rather than trying to provide biological or legal proof in a modern sense.
That seems to be where the evidence points. They are asserting a theological reality. Jesus is the rightful Davidic heir, Jesus is the Son of God connected to Adam, and using the genealogical format as a powerful rhetorical tool to make that assertion, regardless of the internal contradictions or the paradox of the virgin birth.
Let's circle back to Matthew for a moment. You mentioned the editorial seams showing the compression compared to older texts like Chronicles.
Right. Brown's work really highlights this. Matthew wasn't just passively copying an existing list, he was actively editing. He condensed the line of kings, particularly after the exile, squishing figures known from Ezra and Nehemiah to make that final panel hit the magic number 14.
So he's shaping the material very deliberately.
Absolutely. It shows the author acting as a composer, making choices to fit a predetermined design, not just a scribe preserving whatever names were in front of him.
And this fits with what scholars like Randall Helms argue about how the gospel writers often worked, right? Building new stories or lists from older scripture.
Exactly. Helms makes a strong case that the evangelists weren't always reporting raw history, but were often creatively reusing and reinterpreting stories, prophecies, and even lists from the Hebrew Bible to construct their narratives about Jesus.
So the genealogies might be examples of that, crafted from scripture for scripture.
Helms would argue they are prime examples. They take biblical names and history and weave them into a new structure designed specifically to place Jesus within that scriptural narrative as the ultimate king for Matthew or the universal Adam for Luke. They're rhetorical devices built from existing holy texts to serve the new theological claims, not dusty records from an archive.
And because these lists were so obviously different and the Joseph problem was so apparent, people noticed immediately, which led to the whole history of trying to harmonize them.
Yes, and that history is incredibly revealing. It shows the early church recognized the discrepancies as a problem needing a solution. The most famous, and arguably most complex, attempt is the Levirate hypothesis.
Who came up with that, and what exactly is it?
It's attributed to a historian named Julius Africanus, writing back in the 3rd century, and his explanation was preserved by the later church historian Eusebius. It's quite intricate.
Walk us through it. How does it try to make Jacob and Heli both Joseph's father, essentially?
Okay, buckle up. The basic idea proposed was this. Joseph's mother was married twice. First, maybe to Heli, Luke's father. Heli dies childless. Then, under the law of levirate marriage, where a brother was obligated to marry his deceased brother's widow to raise up heirs for the dead brother, Heli's brother, Jacob, Matthew's father, marries the widow.
So Jacob fathers Joseph biologically.
But legally, Joseph is considered the son of the deceased Heli, preserving his line. Or, you could flip it, Jacob dies first, Heli marries the widow. The point is, through this mechanism, Joseph could technically have both a biological father from one list and a legal father from the other list.
That sounds incredibly complicated, and it had to explain not just the father difference, but the whole Solomon versus Nathan split, too.
Yes. For it to work fully, you'd need Jacob and Heli to somehow represent the ends of those two vastly different lines, descending from Solomon and Nathan, converging through this complex marriage arrangement involving Joseph's mother. It requires multiple convenient deaths and remarriages, perfectly aligning two almost entirely separate lineages onto one person.
It sounds custom-made, tailored exactly to fix the problem.
That's precisely Richard Carrier's critique. He argues these harmonization theories are completely ad hoc. They're invented after the fact, purely to resolve the contradictions, with no independent evidence supporting such a complex family history. They're infinitely flexible. You could invent similar stories to harmonize almost any two lists.
So the fact that you need such an elaborate, unproven explanation
Strongly suggests the original texts were never intended to be read as compatible, straightforward records. The sheer ingenuity required for the harmonization basically admits the original documents were broken, in an archival sense. The harmonization effort becomes evidence against the lists being simple history.
All right, so as we approach a verdict based on this critical analysis, scholars look at how the lists might have been composed. Two main possibilities, right? Independence or dependence.
Yes, and crucially, both scenarios lead to the same conclusion about the genre.
Okay, explain independence first. What if Matthew and Luke just drew on completely separate family traditions that were floating around?
If they were independent, then the fact that these supposed traditions resulted in lists that are almost totally different from David down to Joseph tells you something about those traditions. It suggests they weren't fixed, stable, archival records. They must have been fluid, perhaps legendary creations. And if the source traditions were fluid and unreliable, then the lists based on them can't claim archival accuracy.
So independence implies unreliable sources, undermining the claim. What about dependence? What if, say, Luke knew Matthew's list, or they both used some earlier source and one consciously changed it?
Well, if there was dependence, let's imagine Luke knew a list like Matthew's, tracing through Solomon and Jeconiah, and then Luke chose to create a completely different list, going through Nathan and back to Adam. That's an even clearer sign of intentional composition.
Why?
Because it means Luke wasn't just passively receiving a tradition. He was actively overriding an existing one to fit his own different theological agenda, the universal scope, the atom connection. Whether they worked from fluid sources or one deliberately changed an existing one, the outcome is the same. Theological purpose trumped accurate record-keeping. The lists are revealed as literary projects.
Okay, this has been a really deep dive into structure, numbers, names, theology, logic. Let's try to boil it down. Can we synthesize the key findings into maybe 3 core conclusions for the listener?
I think we can. First, Matthew's list shows unmistakable signs of deliberate design. The 3 by 14 structure, the gematria linked to David, the strategic omissions, the emblematic women, even using the risky Jeconiah line, it all points to an overt theological goal. Crafting a Davidic identity through the very form of the genealogy.
Okay, thesis 1. Matthew's architecture reveals theological composition for a Davidic purpose. What's the second?
Second, Luke's list shows equally clear, but different, signs of deliberate design. The reverse direction back to Adam, choosing the non-royal Nathanic branch, the vast universal scope, possibly aiming for a symbolic number like 77. This reveals a distinct theological program focused on Jesus as the second Adam and Savior for all humanity.
Thesis 2. Luke's architecture reveals theological composition for a universal purpose. And the third, bringing them together.
Third, the lists are fundamentally incompatible, and the central narrative complicates their function. They diverge almost completely between David and Joseph. This incompatibility, combined with the logical problem that the virgin conception seems to nullify a straightforward biological or simple legal claim through Joseph, solidifies the assessment. These aren't functioning as verifiable records.
I need to push on that word fabrication again, because it sounds like saying they just made it all up. Is that the critical claim? How do you nuance that for someone who holds these texts as sacred?
Right, it's crucial not to misunderstand the term in this context. It's not necessarily alleging malicious deceit in a modern sense. It's saying the authors constructed these lists, using familiar names and biblical echoes, to serve a theological truth they believe profoundly. They employed literary and rhetorical techniques, structure, symbolism, selection, rather than strict archival methods.
So it's fabrication in the sense of making or constructing a literary piece that looks like a genealogy to convey a deeper religious message.
Precisely. It's about the genre and the method. The value of these lists, from this critical perspective, isn't in their historical accuracy as family trees. Their immense value lies in what they reveal about the theology of Matthew and Luke, about what they wanted to proclaim about Jesus' identity and significance. They are theological documents first and foremost.
And that distinction, seeing them as primarily theological documents, rich in literary artistry, rather than archival records, that feels like the core takeaway here. Their value shifts from historical verification to understanding the evangelist's message.
Exactly. Matthew builds a numerical palace to prove Jesus is King David's heir. Luke builds a highway back to creation to show Jesus is the Savior of all humankind. They are theological blueprints.
It really forces you to see the evangelists not just as reporters, but as skilled, sophisticated authors using the tools available to them, numerology, typology, scriptural allusion, to craft powerful arguments.
They were composers, weaving together tradition and theology, not just transcribers copying files.
Okay, so acknowledging this level of deliberate composition, this willingness to shape ancestry for theological ends, it naturally leads to a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to ponder.
If Matthew and Luke felt such freedom to use numerical patterns, selective traditions, maybe even contradictory details, to construct the genealogies, the very foundation of Jesus' background,
What might that imply about their composition methods when crafting other parts of the infancy narratives? The stories around the birth itself, the angels, the magi, the shepherds.
if the framework, the ancestry, shows this much literary artistry and theological shaping, could we expect to find similar markers of construction, similar uses of scriptural templates or symbolic numbers elsewhere in those opening chapters? It's an insight into their workshop, and it might just change how you read those familiar stories too.